Yeah, it's great to be here at the Fit New South Wales seminar. We've heard much about walkability, livability, and the fantastic, work that Transport for New South Wales is doing in creating interconnected networks, and the health benefits of all of those things. And what I'd like to talk about today is the Green Grid, which is a policy framework, and it's a way of putting policy into action to promote the design and delivery of green infrastructure across metropolitan Sydney. Everybody wants to live and work in a place that feels beautiful. And, as we know, by 2054, Sydney's population is set to increase by 80%. And this means that there's going to be approximately an additional 3 people living and working, in Sydney. And, one of the key questions is how do we ensure that Sydney remains one of the most beautiful and livable cities in the world? At the same time, a plan for growing Sydney, which is the new metro plan which has been generated by Planning Environment, calls for Sydney to be a strong global city, and a livable city, a great place to live. And one of the key hallmarks of livability is green space. And the vision for the Sydney Green Grid is to create an interconnected network of high-quality open spaces that connect to town centres, public transport hubs, employment and residential areas. It also promotes the greening of the urban environment. And what I'll be presenting today is a pilot project that we undertook in Parramatta and how we are applying this pilot project across the whole of metropolitan Sydney. The objectives of the Sydney Green Grid are really to increase access to open space, to conserve landscapes and increase access to nature, to adapt the city to the impacts of climate change, simple things like street trees, to make sustainable travel connections and promote cycling and walking, which we've just heard quite a bit about, to encourage healthy living, because as we are aware that there's significant benefits in walking and cycling to the health agenda, and also to enhance visitor destinations to improve the visitor economy. So our work, we were inspired by a project that actually was undertaken in the UK, which was called the East London Green Grid, which was essentially about creating these interconnected networks. And this project was so successful in East London that it actually has become a policy framework and has become the All London Green Grid. So we looked at the methodology that was undertaken in the UK, and we applied this to Parramatta to test this methodology to see whether it actually could be applied at a local scale and therefore at and thereby at a metropolitan scale. So what you see there is a plan for Parramatta. The red is essentially the Westmead Health Precinct, the purple is Camellia, the yellow is the CBD, and the blue is Granville, and the orange at the top is Westmead. There's an not Westmead, University of Western Sydney, Rydalmere. There's an enormous amount of development that is happening in Western Sydney and Parramatta, so we thought that this would be a significant place to do a pilot. What we started off by doing was actually looking at the planning guidelines for open space, and we did an open space audit of Parramatta, and we looked at regional open space, district open space, and local open space. And there are a number of guidelines which we followed. So, for example, everybody should live within 5 to 10 kilometres of a regional open space. Everybody should live within 2 kilometres of a district open space and 400 metres of a local space. A local open space. There are also other dimensions, sort of quantum per capita. But what we looked at and what we found in Parramatta is that, Parramatta was very well endowed with regional open space. At a district level, there was some deficiencies, and at a local level there were additional deficiencies, but a lot of this was associated with land use. So you can see where the dark pink is, which is identifying where the major deficiencies are. That's around, that's associated with Camellia at the moment, and we know that the use in Camellia is going to change, and there will be an opportunity to look at that in the future. So what we did on the basis of these deficiencies, we identified, where are the key strategic places that you might put additional open space to create this interconnected network. So really what we're trying to do is to promote access to open space so that there's an equity of access to open space, which is really important. So, Parramatta is actually, defined by the Parramatta River, which is really the jewel in the crown of Parramatta River. And we heard just, how there's the cycle links and the cycle valley, and there's this interconnected network that's actually being developed. And what this interconnected network of open space does, it starts highlighting to the community and visitors the exquisite places that are on offer in Parramatta that are currently not often seen. So part of the network also actually has ecological functions, so you can actually use the natural systems to manage flooding. So it's about actually ensuring that these systems remain natural, and also the potential to use these systems as part of the open space network. As I said before, we were looking at improving the visitor experience. So what we identified in that area, Parramatta, like most places, actually has a wealth of heritage items, and it's how do you bring these heritage places to the fore and to enable people to interact with these places. So by mapping them and linking them to the interconnected network, there's an opportunity for the general public to engage with places that they might not have come into contact with, and this provides the opportunity to boost the visitor economy. So in keeping with what we heard before, we kind of looked at the centres within Parramatta. We mapped the 5-kilometre radius around Parramatta, which is what's considered as the healthy, the 20-minute cycle. And we started identifying, how you could actually use the open space network to facilitate these connections. So there's the opportunity to use the river and creek corridors, which is something that we're promoting, as well as using the open space, the public domain, the streets, which we heard a lot about in the previous conversations. How do you actually create complete streets to facilitate these dimensions? And the other thing that we're also very keen to look at, so this was the Western Sydney Light Rail, how do you actually use these proposed transport corridors to also form part of these links, so that these transport corridors actually become boulevards, not only for light rail, but actually opportunities for walking and cycling, and they become these fantastic tree-lined streets, which is the public domain, which is actually gluing all these places together. So, what this diagram shows is the layering that we've actually used. So what you see at the bottom is basically Parramatta's open space network. You've got these neighbourhood centres, which form part of the street network. You've got the existing and the future transport networks, and then you've got the interconnected network of pathways. So if you layer all these dimensions, what you ultimately have is this interconnected network of open space, which starts creating a new dimension for these places. So what are the benefits of the green grid? Well, it provides a spatial framework for regional for planning. It provides an opportunity to put policy into action. It adds value to urban development. It increases access to open space, promotes healthy living, that improves sustainable travel connections, enhances biodiversity and increases access to nature, and helps deal with climate extremes and urban greening, and has the potential, as the first speaker was talking about, to really boost the economy of each town. So what we are, this pilot project that we have done, we are now working with the sub-regional planning team and looking at how to apply these principles and this methodology at a sub-regional level. And that work will be released down the track. But what I will show you is the methodology that we've done to inform some of the sub-regional thinking that is actually happening. So essentially, the Creek network is identified as the open space framework, and that is like almost the landscape layer. And then we also looked at the existing regional open space. And Sydney, is very fortunate. We are so well endowed. In the north, we've got the Royal National Park. We've got Coringa. In the south, we've got the Royal. We've got Western Sydney Parklands. There's an extraordinary wealth of regional open space that we have, and national parks, which is there to be taken advantage of. So we looked at, we've done this layering strategy over these metropolitan maps. We layered, the bike strategy. We looked at the city shapers. We looked at the transit network. We looked at, then this map says the UAPs, but now they're called the priority precincts, the urban activation precincts. And on the basis of this, we've kind of developed a network building on the early work that was done as well for these regional open space connections across metropolitan Sydney. So we developed this framework of primary connections, and then we've drilled down a little bit deeper to look at, how this can be applied, at a more local level. And what this actually does is that this gives, this is the framework for the Sydney Green Grid, which we are hoping with time will iteratively be implemented across metropolitan Sydney. Thank you.